It's Halloween on Disney+. Watch frightful family favorites like Hocus Pocus and Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas on Disney+.
I am the Pumpkin King!
Then take the terror to 10 with a thrilling new remake of The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, Scream, and more with Halloween on Disney+. All these and more screaming this Halloween season with Hulu on Disney+. Bundle subscription required. 18+. Select Hulu content via Disney+. Additional content on Hulu app. Terms apply. Visit disneyplus.com/Hulu for details.
This episode is brought to you by Tic Tac. Your boss is going off at you for missing a deadline and you swear the clock just moved backwards. Suddenly, you remember the pack of Tic Tacs on your desk. Now you're riding horseback on the beach, the smell of citrus in the air. And what's this? Your boss is sitting behind you, breathing heavenly fresh mint? Refresh your mouth and mind and share your good vibes with Tic Tac.
This is True Spies, the podcast that takes you deep inside the greatest secret missions of all time. Week by week, you'll hear the true stories behind the operations that have shaped the world we live in. You'll meet the people who live life undercover. What do they know? What are their skills? And what would you do in their position? I'm Rhiannon Needs, and this is True Spies from SPYSCAPE Studios. The Great Illegals, Part 1. The Whistler. August, 1943. The Soviet Red Army is locked in a grueling campaign to expel Germany's occupying forces from its territory. A campaign that has already cost hundreds of thousands of Russian lives. And on the outskirts of Moscow, 2 more young communists are preparing to join the fight.
They're put in an unmarked plane, which is camouflaged in grey-green paint and has no lights, and it takes off from a military airfield outside Moscow and heads west. Inside the rattling tin can, the men are full of trepidation. Their names are Nikolai Khokhlov and Karl Klein-Young, but they have left those identities on the dirt runway behind them. Karl and Nikolai have flight overalls on, but underneath that they're wearing German military uniforms, and they have documents, forged documents that they've been provided that suggest that they are from the military secret police. From this moment on, Nikolai is to become Senior Lieutenant Otto Wittgenstein. Karl will be Corporal Schulze. Their destination is not the front line, but a point well beyond that, deep into occupied Belarus. Once there, the men will need to pass themselves off as Nazi soldiers. Adding to their anxiety is the fact that only one of them, Karl, is a native German speaker. A problem that their legend has been designed to disguise. The idea is that Nikolai is the senior officer, he won't say too much, and Karl will essentially do all the talking for the pair of them. Over their uniforms, the pair wear parachutes in clunky backpacks. They pray that they won't need to use them. They're kind of in the dark, cold back of this plane as it's juddering at quite a low altitude. And at some point, the co-pilot comes out of the cockpit in a fur jacket and shouts, "We're crossing the front lines." Karl and Nikolai brace themselves for the thud of anti-aircraft fire. They are prepared to leap from the plane at a moment's notice. But on this night, they were lucky, and the plane flew on to a place where it had been prearranged. There was a partisan makeshift airfield in the forest. So there were 3 fires that had been lit by the partisans to show where this field was, and the plane comes banking down steeply and lands bumpily in this field. And as soon as it lands, Nikolai looks out of the window and he can see people damping down the fires, putting them out to disguise this landing point as quickly as possible. The young agents have landed some 40 miles outside of Minsk, the occupied Belarusian capital. And they jump out of the plane, and a man addresses them by their code names, Victor and Volin, and shakes their hands
With an escort of 10 soldiers in khaki, the men hastily make their way from the airfield, along a quiet country road, and then through a swampy marsh. Finally, as dawn breaks, they arrive at a small partisan encampment.
And there, a colonel who's working with the partisans, whose name is Kutsin, he meets Nikolai, and he finally tells him what the mission is going to be for him.
Up to this point, the purpose of this infiltration has been kept obscure. Perhaps because no sane agent, no matter how plucky, would agree to it in advance. But now, as the young Russian spy, Nikolai, listens to the colonel in a grubby little camp deep in enemy territory, he realizes there will be no turning back. He has his mission.
And the mission is that he has to try to assassinate Wilhelm Kube, who is the Nazi governor of Belarus.
In the pink morning light, Nikolai listens as his destiny is revealed. The plan is, without question, madness. But he soon learns there is a method to it.
So Kutsin explains to Nikolai that the governor of occupied Belarus, Kube, is pretty difficult to access. He rides in a closed car. He only appears for short periods at his office. He takes a lot of security precautions. And that's why they need someone like Nikolai, because the partisans have no chance of getting close enough to him to launch an assassination attempt. But Nikolai, posing as a Nazi officer in uniform, he was going to have a much better chance of getting close.
And with that, the briefing is over. Nikolai and Karl are headed for the eye of the storm to kill the senior-most Nazi in the region. Their only protection, the German uniforms on their backs, and a cover story that will crumple like a paper napkin under any scrutiny. Best of luck, boys. Let's leave Nikolai and Karl where they are for now, staring down the barrel of an impossible mission, so I can introduce you to the man who is telling you their story.
I'm Shaun Walker. I'm an international correspondent with The Guardian newspaper. I spent more than a decade living in and reporting on Russia, and I'm the author of a recent book which I've spent the last almost a decade researching, which is called The Illegals, and it's about Russia's deepest cover spies.
Russia's storied illegals program has long been the stuff of Cold War legend. But Shaun Walker's entry point to the phenomenon came from a later period, shortly after 10 deep-cover Russian agents were exposed by the FBI in 2010.
It was actually an interview I did in 2016 with the two sons of a couple of illegals that had been arrested in the US in 2010. And the sons had only found out that they weren't ordinary Canadian Americans on the 20th birthday of the older son when the FBI came to arrest their parents. So I spoke to them about what it was like to have everything they thought they knew about their childhoods upended in this way.
In that interview, Shaun saw that the illegals program was nothing less than a prism through which to view the Russian psyche.
I felt it was, on the one hand, this sort of fascinating psychological story about what it's like to live in another skin and to lie to everyone around you, including sometimes your children. And on the other hand, I thought this was such a uniquely Russian program. And the more I researched it, the more I saw that it went back decades right to the Russian Revolution, and kind of at every stage of the way, what was happening in the illegals program gives us, I think, a really interesting insight into Russia, the Soviet Union at the time.
As Shaun says, this is a story that begins with the most dramatic upheaval in modern history.
So the origin of the illegals program really comes even before the Russian Revolution of 1917. Lenin and the Bolsheviks, when they were in opposition to the Tsarist regime, they were a tight-knit, conspiratorial underground party. and they were used to using disguises, pseudonyms. Some of them would live undercover for years on end. And Lenin called these people illegal operatives, those who operated clandestinely. They didn't use their real names. They weren't the legal operatives who stood for parliament or worked for trade unions. And so when the Bolsheviks take over after the October Revolution, they basically repurpose a lot of this tradecraft and heritage as the basis for their new intelligence service. And they have a lot of very passionate, talented communists who speak multiple languages, who've lived in different places, who are experienced working in the underground. And these people become the first spies, really, of the Soviet Union, and they're later known as the Great Illegals.
These so-called Great Illegals were born out of a fledgling nation's survivalist instinct.
In the 1920s, when the Bolshevik regime is fragile, it's new, it's young, and of course, it's not recognized by many other countries as a legitimate government. They're expecting some form of Tsarism or some new revolution to sweep them away. So what does this mean? It means that the Bolshevik regime doesn't have diplomatic relations with a lot of places, therefore it doesn't have embassies, therefore it can't send diplomats, and certainly not spies pretending to be diplomats, which of course is the classic way to disguise spies. So it uses the illegals instead. It's kind of a brilliant solution using the pool of talented, multilingual, passionate communists that they have at their disposal.
In the earliest days of the revolution, the Great Illegals had two tasks.
One was to protect the revolution, as Lenin would have put it. So to kind of try to infiltrate, gain information about the remnants of the white forces, the anti-Bolshevik, pro-Tsarist forces who were exiled in capitals all around Europe, and to try to forestall any plots that they might have with the aid of Western powers to bring down the Bolshevik regime. And the second was really the classic espionage goal of finding out the secrets of rival countries. So trying to understand what were the European powers thinking, what were their plans with regards to the Soviet Union.
And yet by the mid-1930s, it wouldn't take a troop of illegal spies to divine the thoughts and intentions of Europe's most powerful leaders.
As the 1930s go on, we see that the Soviet Union is becoming an established part of the global order. Nobody expects it to be swept away by a revolution tomorrow. There are now diplomatic relations with a lot of countries, even many of whom despise communism. But there is these twin threats on either side of the Soviet borders. To the east, there's the increasing Japanese militarism, and of course, much more threateningly, there's the rise of Nazi Germany to the west. And this is something that Stalin is very worried about. His fear of the rise of Nazi Germany may contribute to the fact that he launches a huge number of bloody repressions in the lead up to the war period.
In the growing confidence of Hitler's Germany, Stalin identifies a threat to the very existence of the Soviet dream.
And then in 1939, Stalin signs very controversially a non-aggression pact between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. The fight against fascism was one of the key kind of rallying calls for the Soviet Union. And now what we have is this uneasy alliance between Moscow and Berlin.
It is against the backdrop of this doomed alliance that we are to meet the true spies at the center of this particular story. The very same pair who you saw earlier, sitting in the back of an unmarked Douglas aircraft, steeling themselves for the infiltration ahead. At this very moment, they are waiting in the wings, ready to claim their place in the history of the Great Illegals.
Did my card go through?
Oh no.
Your small business depends on its internet, so switch to Verizon Business. And you could get LTE business internet starting at $39 a month when paired with select business mobile plans. That's unlimited data for unlimited business.
There we go.
Get the internet you need at the price you want. Verizon Business. Starting price for LTE Business Internet, 25 megabits per second, unlimited data plan with select Verizon Business smartphone plan savings. Terms apply.
Are your business expenses playing hide and seek? With Uber for Business, the small spends that slip through the cracks, like rides and meals, go right where you need them. Because it integrates with leading expense platforms, you can say goodbye to surprise costs, missing dollars, or chasing receipts. Everything's track downable. Uber for Business. Make small steps that make a big impact. Learn more at uber.com/small steps.
Nikolai Khokhlov is born in 1922, and he grows up dreaming of being a film actor. But he doesn't quite make the cut to the leading film institute in the Soviet Union. And instead, he is sent off to a place where they study what's known as music hall arts. And he ends up with the rather unusual profession of a concert whistler.
Of all the dozens of spies we've met on this show, and the countless improbable backstories, there is perhaps none so quaint as that of Nikolai Khokhlov, the cheery concert whistler.
And he begins in the spring of 1941 to tour the Soviet Union as part of a kind of cabaret variety show that is meant to boost morale among Soviet citizens at a time when the threat of war is looming.
When that threat becomes reality, in June of the same year, Nikolai is back home in Moscow. Like so many children of the Bolshevik Revolution, he is determined to throw his lot into the war effort.
Many of his friends go to the front, his stepfather goes to the front, but he's actually rejected on the basis that he has major eye problems, his vision isn't perfect.
Instead, Nikolai is told to keep up the whistling. Morale will be an important part of the war effort too.
He gets a part in a patriotic film that's shooting far to the east of the military action in the Urals. And so he goes off for a couple of months to shoot this role, and he doesn't return to Moscow until September 1941.
In the few months that Nikolai has been away, the atmosphere in Moscow has shifted dramatically.
The German advance has been swift, ruthless, and although there has been fierce resistance, it hasn't been enough to stop the Germans, and they get really close to the outskirts of Moscow.
With the war effort going so drastically wrong, Nikolai decides to try once again to volunteer for the army.
So first of all, Nikolai goes to the local duty office. He says again, is there anything he can do? He wants to sign up. And he's given a phone number, essentially, and told to call it. So he calls the number. He's told to give his address and wait at home. And before long, he's picked up by a car and taken to the Lubyanka, which is the headquarters of the Soviet security services, which would later be known as the KGB.
At the Lubyanka, Nikolai is brought to the 7th floor office of a man named Mikhail Makliowski, a man who is deep in preparations for a daring operation.
The Soviet regime thinks that just like in 1812, when Napoleon marched on Moscow and the Tsarist forces abandoned the city, burned it, retreated, and then later regrouped and moved on towards eventual victory, this might be what has to happen now. So massive plans are underway for the full evacuation of the capital, for the government to move further east, for sensitive documents to be burned, and to essentially surrender Moscow to the Nazis.
Nikolai listens, rapt, as the NKVD officer unfurls the details of his plot.
And he's basically told that plans are underway for the evacuation of Moscow, and that what the Soviet authorities are trying to do is to create a kind of cadre of left-behind agents who will remain in Moscow during the occupation and will carry out sabotage work. And Nikolai's been earmarked because his training as a variety show performer seems to the NKVD to be the perfect cover.
The logic goes that once Nazi forces take Moscow, they will be in a celebratory mood. If Nikolai can convince the occupiers that he supports them, he might be given an opportunity to perform in the inevitable victory parades. Just imagine the damage he could do.
Then they could start launching explosions, sabotage, all of the things that Nikolai was about to find out about. So he was told he'd be part of a 4-person troupe. So he was the whistler. There was also an actor, a singer, and a juggler. And the 4 of them would practice their routine now before the occupation of Moscow. They would perhaps go off to the front, give some performances. This would, on the one hand, help boost morale. On the other hand, it would get them used to performing together. And then once the Germans came, they would wait behind and begin very different activities.
Makliowski asks the young patriot before him if he's willing to accept this great responsibility. And Nikolai, for his part, doesn't hesitate. The whistler's training begins right away.
There's not much time, and there's a real sense of urgency in Moscow at this moment, but there's still some quite intense and impressive training. So Nikolai's apartment kind of becomes the headquarters for this small group of conspirators, and the NKVD brings them food, money, and weapons, which includes pistols, grenades, and explosives. And they're taken out to fields on the edges of Moscow where they're taught about how to set booby traps, how to use electric detonators, and also how to build very simple and very crude bombs.
Meanwhile, the city continues its hasty preparations for the arrival of the Nazis.
As October comes, the Germans are getting closer and closer to Moscow. They're right on the outskirts of the city. And on the 8th of October, the State Defense Committee orders the full preparation for a retreat. So this involves mining hundreds of factories and other strategic locations so that when the order would come, all of these places would be blown up and Hitler would be left with a kind of smoldering ruins of a city rather than a functioning metropolis.
On that day, the ash of burnt documents falls from the sky like early snow.
Nikolai and his 3 companions are summoned to the Lubyanka, and they're walking through the center of Moscow. To get there, there's smoke and this kind of acrid smell in the air. There's a kind of chaotic scene as thousands of people are heading to the railway stations to travel east in evacuation.
When they arrive at the Lubyanka, they find the building in a state of disarray. On the 7th floor, Makliowski awaits them once again.
He gathers the 4 of them and he says, "What can I say to you children? Nothing good. We're leaving Moscow. German tanks are already on the outskirts of the city. Remember what you are defending. Wait for communications and instructions." And he gives them a farewell kiss. They go off down the corridor and he shouts after them, "We'll meet in the underground."
With that, the troop are on their own, with nothing to do but wait for the thunderous arrival of the German tanks, and with them, their destiny.
So the 4 of them stay behind. They're in Nikolai's flat. They're kind of nervously smoking, drinking, waiting for the moment when the Germans will come as Moscow becomes emptier and emptier.
But in the end, destiny never arrives.
The Wehrmacht doesn't make it to Moscow. The Red Army defensive action manages to repel them. There is this extraordinary moment on November the 7th, which is the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, and Stalin orders a huge military parade on Red Square. He has decided not to evacuate. He stands and looks over this parade. The tanks go straight from the parade to the front lines. And it's this real show that boosts morale.
It's an early turning point in a war that is only just beginning for the Soviet Union. And though the Whistler has been spared this particular dance with death, he too will have a role to play in the arduous years ahead. By December 1941, the Red Army has pushed the Wehrmacht back from the edge of Moscow, but the Germans still control swathes of Soviet territory.
So large parts of Soviet, Belarus, Ukraine, and the westernmost areas of Russia have fallen to Nazi occupation in the first few months of the war. And so the security services start to think about how they can engineer work behind enemy lines, how they can utilize the kind of nascent partisan movements in these places, but also how they can send their own operatives in across the lines. And this is where this long heritage of illegal work comes into play again. So they realize that if they can send people in who can convincingly pose as Germans, that will give them hugely more options and opportunities than partisans who have to hide out in the forest and run away every time they see an approaching Nazi troop.
It's in this slowly percolating plan that Nikolai Khokhlov, the Whistler, is about to find a new purpose.
The same guy who recruited Nikolai Makliarsky, he shows up at Nikolai's apartment on New Year's Eve, 1941, with a bottle of wine and some flowers. And he says, look, you thought you did an amazing job in your previous mission, and actually, it was a little bit amateur.
Word had reached the center that Nikolai and his troop had been speaking grandly about destiny and duty as they awaited the invasion that never came. Now, the spy master gently chastises his agent for those loose lips.
I think the minute probably had the Germans made it to Moscow, you were talking too much to your friends about the secret, exciting tasks you had to perform. It might not have been too long before you were caught. However, we do recognize that though you have something about you, we think you could be useful to us, and we have a new exciting opportunity for you. And the way he pitches this actually is he says, we remember that you used to dream of being an actor. Well, now your dream can come true, but you're not going to be acting on a stage. You're going to be acting in real life.
And the role that Nikolai will play?
His task is going to be essentially to take on the role of a Nazi convincingly enough that he can be dropped behind enemy lines and pass for one.
If Nikolai has to think twice, he doesn't show it. He accepts his new mission on the spot. Outside, revelers bring in the new year. Within months, he will begin rehearsals for the role of a lifetime.
In the summer of 1942, Nikolai starts his training. Part of this is tradecraft. He learns how to mix vodka and glucose into a solution that enables you to write letters in invisible ink. He's taught how to decode radio messages, and he's also given some shooting practice. And of course, key for his upcoming mission, he has to practice parachute jumps from small Douglas airplanes. But probably much more importantly than all of this, because it's what the success of the entire mission is predicated on, he has to learn how to speak, look, walk, think like a German. And for this, the NKVD puts him in an apartment with a German communist called Karl Kleinjung, who had fled Germany after the Nazi takeover.
Though German by birth and distinctly Aryan in his features, Karl was as faithful a Soviet servant as the center could hope to find. After fleeing the Nazis, he had fought on the side of the communists in the Spanish Civil War and settled afterwards in the Soviet Union. Under Karl's tutelage, Nikolai undergoes a crash course in German language and mentality, though much has changed in his homeland since Karl fled. Together, they study Nazi propaganda pamphlets, newspapers, and radio broadcasts.
This sort of puts them in the mindset, but of course it's not enough. So they're taken to a prisoner of war camp not too far outside Moscow, where they're able to interview captured Germans about their everyday lives as a Nazi officer.
Nikolai and Karl grill the captured Nazis for particulars. How do you march? How do you greet your superiors? What slang do you use?
Basically, all these tics and these little things that could be so telltale in the field.
But until they can put those quirks to the test, it will all remain dangerously abstract. And so the NKVD arranged for Nikolai and Karl to visit another camp. This time, not as interrogators, but prisoners.
It's been arranged that they're actually going to be given German uniforms and they're going to spend time in this camp and see if they can pass as real captured Germans among other captured Germans. Only the commander of the camp knows who they really are. Nikolai, of course, I mean, his German by this point is pretty good, but it's not native. So he's trying his hardest to really not to speak unless he's spoken to blend in, to observe. And so they spend a few weeks in this camp, looking at the other Germans, listening to their stories, trying to pretend they don't understand anything when it's in Russian, when the guards or nearby villagers are barking abuse at them. And then once a day in the evening, they spend an hour with their NKVD supervisors going over how the day went, what they'd learned, what they still needed to work on.
By the end of a month in the German camp, Karl and Nikolai have surprised even themselves by completely evading suspicion. There is no further training the NKVD could offer them.
In August 1943, they're finally ready. It's been, a year of training, quite a long time in the chaos of war, perhaps not that long to convincingly take on the identity of a soldier of another country. But they're put in an unmarked plane, which is camouflaged in grey-green paint and has no lights, and it takes off from a military airfield outside Moscow and heads west.
It's on this plane that we first met Karl and Nikolai, dressed in their German uniforms at the very beginning of this episode. You already know what comes next. The bumpy ride across enemy lines to Belarus, the makeshift airfield, the hike through forest and swamp. In a partisan encampment outside of Minsk, they finally received their mission: the assassination of the Nazi governor in charge of the capital.
So, Wilhelm Kube, he's 53 at this point. He's been a long-standing ideological Nazi. He was a member of the party back since 1927, and he spent his spare time writing kind of plays on sinister German folk themes. And in fact, his wife was an actress who'd acted in one of his plays. And so he and his wife and their children lived in a villa in central Minsk. And, Kube was a ruthless operator. He did get into arguments with the SS because he thought that the sheer ruthlessness of the retributive tactics of the SS in and around Minsk was only creating support for the partisan movement. But of course, he was no humanitarian, and he kind of oversaw the rounding up of Minsk's very sizable Jewish community and cramming them into the ghetto, and most of them would not survive the war.
For this, and his other crimes against the population of Minsk, Kube is a hated figure. And so he lives a closely guarded existence, never risking public appearances. But it will be Nikolai and Karl's job to find a way to reach and eliminate him all the same. For the next 2 weeks, the agents codenamed Victor and Volin undergo final preparations at the partisan encampment. And then it is time for the next phase of their mission. An escort guides them on foot to the nearest village.
And then they're basically left by the side of the road in their Nazi uniforms on the outskirts of Minsk, left to their own devices.
This is the moment they have been working towards for more than a year. The pair of them are on their own in enemy territory. If they are to survive out here, they'll need to jump into their cover stories head first.
So Karl and Nikolai walk from this village onto the nearest main road, and they flag down a passing military truck. And Karl, as they've agreed, does the talking. He says, they need a lift to Minsk.
With his best lieutenant's German, Karl tells them that they'll be happy to hitch a ride on the flatbed on the back of the truck. with the unit's equipment.
But the soldier in the front sees Nikolai's rank and immediately jumps out and offers him to sit in the compartment with the rest of them, and this soldier will go and sit in the back.
Holding court with an entire truck's worth of German officers with no help from Karl sounds like a fast way to end this mission before it's even begun. Nikolai needs to think fast.
He mutters something about travel sickness and that he doesn't want to sit at the front, he wants to sit at the back. So both Nikolai and Karl jump in the back of the truck and it heads on towards Minsk.
First hurdle cleared, albeit just barely. As Nikolai and Karl hop off the truck in central Minsk, it becomes apparent they will need to grow comfortable with close shaves. All around them, Nazi officers swarm. They must make it to their safe house fast.
So at the partisan camp, Nikolai and Karl have been given the names of some of the partisan operatives, mostly women, who are incongruous enough that they're able to slip in and out of the checkpoints into Minsk and operate inside the city itself, where they have a series of safe houses. So they're given an address, they head off to this address in their German uniforms, sometimes being saluted by passing German officers, sometimes noticing that the locals are sort of keeping their heads down at the sight of these two officers passing. And they get to the address that they agreed on, they knock on the door, and out comes one of the women that they had met at the partisan camp, who sort of throws her arms around Nikolai and says, "Otto, darling, you've arrived," pulls them inside.
At the safe house, Karl and Nikolai are introduced to a small local collective of partisan rebels. At first, they seem jumpy around the two Aryan men in Nazi uniforms. And that skepticism runs both ways.
And of course, this is pretty terrifying because all it needs is for just one of these people to be an informer for the Gestapo and the game is up. But they have no choice but to trust these people.
Over the next few days, as though easing themselves into a boiling hot bath, Nikolai and Karl begin to venture out into Minsk and test the strength of their cover stories.
The documents they have are for the military secret police, and this was an organization where the operatives could be in uniform but were also sometimes in civilian clothes. So this gave them the cover to also buy a couple of suits so they could walk around the town not in their uniforms and perhaps be a little bit lower profile.
Soon, they have knowledge of a whole network of partisan safe houses and operatives. Little by little, they are beginning to feel comfortable.
When they hear news that a partisan has been shot dead wearing a German uniform, so suddenly this brilliant cover that they thought they had, they're walking around in their uniforms, nobody's going to suspect a thing. Suddenly there's a sense that perhaps people are on the lookout for this kind of operative, and they start to get nervous. Every corner they're worried about who might be looking at them. Does their uniform look convincing?
Quickly, the fear of exposure catches up to them. They are drifting around Minsk with forged documents and shredded nerves, just waiting for the question that will end everything. This is no way to go about their mission. They decide that if they're to make any headway, they will need to confront their fears face on. And so they venture into the belly of the beast.
They go to a casino that's been opened by the German occupiers in the cafe of a former factory. And this is a place where Nazi officers gathered. They like to drink there, to gamble there, to sing there. Kube himself, the governor, would often visit and sort of pick particularly pretty young croupiers from the tables to go and work on his staff. And so Nikolai and Karl go into this smoky room and they sit at one of the tables drinking mugs of beer. Karl gets chatting to a corporal from Cologne. Nikolai sort of does his turn as the moody superior who doesn't really want to talk to anyone. And they sit there as the entertainment for the evening comes out, who is a man in a clown suit who's kind of shouting out jokes in this crazy accent that Nikolai can't quite understand. But he then moves into a musical number, He's bashing out the tune on the piano. Everyone's singing along. Before long, Nikolai's picked up the words as well. Him and Carl join in, and they realize as they look around this kind of smoky, boozy scene that nobody is giving them a second glance, and they're fitting in perfectly.
It is only once they have sung, arm in arm with the enemy they are trying to defeat, that Nikolai and Carl can truly turn to the task at hand, confident in their cover. Through their growing partisan network, they learn more and more about the reclusive governor, Kube.
Once they start finding out a bit about Kube and his routine, Nikolai and Carl begin to think that probably the best way to get to him, perhaps the only way, is going to be through the very small number of Soviet citizens who work in his villa as housekeepers, maids, and so on. Many of them were those women that Kube had sort of personally picked on in the casino. And they hear about one particular woman whose name is Yelena Mazanik, and she doesn't work for Kube, but she works for Kube's deputy, Karl Wildenstein. She was also working in the casino. Wildenstein had seen her there, taken a shine to her, and employed her as his maid. And he had a kind of small suite of rooms on the second floor of Kube's mansion.
Nikolai and Carl realize that Yelena could be the perfect insider to help them in their plot. She has daily access to the governor's home and workplace, but is far enough removed from his inner circle of workers to evade the glare of his paranoia. But convincing this young woman to put herself directly in harm's way will not be simple. Nikolai must tread carefully.
As every good recruitment, it starts off with a piece of information. So Nikolai is told that Yelena has a husband, and her husband is alive and well, and he's working for the NKVD as a driver in Siberia, having managed to flee when she didn't. So Nikolai arranged for one of his local contacts in the underground to whisper to Yelena that someone has arrived from Moscow and they have information about her husband.
One can scarcely even imagine what must be going through Yelena's mind when she arrives to this most secretive of meetings and is greeted by a blonde-haired, blue-eyed man in the uniform of a Nazi officer.
He tells her, your husband is alive, he's in good health, and then he says that he has come with a mission and that he needs her as a Soviet patriot to help him. And he uses a kind of mix of charm and threats.
Nikolai tells Yelena that he understands that she has been driven to work for the Nazi governor by self-preservation. He knows where her true loyalty lies.
He says, our country still trusts you, but there is a limit. For a long time, you've refused to face the truth, and now you have to. And then he says, I'm not threatening you, although it sounds very much like a threat to her. And he sees that she looks incredibly nervous. So he says, listen, don't give me your answer straight away, but you are in a position where there can only be one answer. So let's meet again later.
With that, Nikolai sends Yelena away to try to make sense of this strange encounter.
So a week later, Nikolai comes to meet Yelena again. He's dressed up in his full uniform. He's got a bright pink package under his arm. It looks like a gift for a lover.
Again, Nikolai makes his pitch.
He says to her that what he's giving her is a rare opportunity to help in a mission that will go down in the history of the war. And she says, listen, I want nothing to do with this. But she doesn't kick him out. And he tells her, look, you've got two options, basically. You can either give me the full information about Kube's movements and help me and Carl to get into the villa so that we can then ambush him with a grenade.
Or, he says, as he slowly pushes the neatly wrapped pink package across the table to her,
you can use this magnetic bomb and you can take it when he's at work, affix it to the underside of his bed, and then set it to go off later in the night.
For the first time, Yelena understands the gravity of the predicament she's been thrust into. She looks to Nikolai pleadingly, but he is unmoved.
And the way Nikolai recalls it, Yelena answers him by saying, I don't know, comrade. And it's that final word that makes Nikolai delighted and excited, because he gets the sense that means she's accepted him, she's accepted the Soviet mission, and she's made up her mind. So he leaves, and he leaves her behind the gift-wrapped bomb.
Shaq here, spinning fast-acting pain relief with Icy Hot. Ice works fast, heat makes it last. Icy Hot, you're so back.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso and Samra Origins by the Weekend Coffee Collection.
Introducing Samra Origins. My collaboration with Nespresso is a connection to my roots, to my mother, Samra. Coffee that hits the right notes. It transports you. Crafted with unique notes and bold, soaring flavors. Experience a taste that moves you. Nespresso and Samra Origins.
Discover more at Nespresso.com.
On September the 21st, 1943, Yelena wakes up early.
She paces around her apartment, running through everything in her head. She puts this little bomb into her handbag, and she walks to work.
Governor Kube's mansion is, at the best of times, a hive of activity. Yelena knows that placing the bomb undetected will not be easy.
So Yelena works for Wildenstein, Kube's deputy. She cleans his suite, and she sometimes cleans also Kube's office and the guest bedrooms. But there are other parts of the mansion that are strictly out of bounds for her. She's not allowed into the dining area, and she's not allowed into Kube's bedroom. So to get in and affix this bomb, she has to come up with a pretty cunning plan.
Shortly after her arrival to the house, Kube and Wildenstein leave for the office.
And the only person left from the Germans in the house is Kube's wife, Anita. So Yelena tells her that she has a toothache and says, if this gets worse, can I go and visit the dentist? And Anita says, of course you can.
Not long after, Anita leaves to run errands.
And the only people left in the house are Yelena and one other local servant. And Yelena knows that this servant has a secret German lover. So she conspiratorially beckons her over and says, listen, the house is empty. If you want, you can sneak upstairs and call your lover from the telephone in Kube's office.
Gratefully, the servant rushes upstairs to make her illicit phone call. At last, Yelena is on her own.
So Yelena picks up a pair of children's trousers and the handbag containing the bomb, and she heads to Kube's bedroom. And her idea is that if anybody catches her and says, what on earth are you doing here? She'll show them the trousers and say that she was looking for some thread because she needed to mend them.
But no one interrupts Yelena. Quickly, she lies down on the floor beside the bed, takes out the contraption and, with shaking hands, fixes it to the underside of the mattress.
It's pretty terrifying. If it falls off, what will happen? Is it fixed properly? But she manages to get it fixed on. She twists the pencil which acts as a detonator and sets it to go off 15 hours later, which would be in the middle of the night.
With every fibre of her being, she wants to run away from the room as fast as she can. But she knows her work is not yet done. Slowly, she lowers herself onto the bed and begins to bounce up and down to make sure the bomb doesn't fall off.
And it doesn't. So she quickly gets her bag and the trousers, runs out of the room, tells the other servant that her toothache has become much worse and that she needs to go to the dentist immediately.
And then, finally, Yelena makes her escape from the Kube mansion.
She goes home, grabs her sister, and they go to a place where they've prearranged a jump-off point where a driver is going to take them to the outskirts of Minsk, and they will run across the lines into the forest.
By that night, they are safe at a partisan encampment deep in the forest. Perhaps Yelena sleeps undisturbed, exhausted from a day of deceit and danger. Or perhaps she lies awake, picturing the explosion that will tear through her employer's bedroom. At the strike of 2 o'clock, does she feel a shiver of understanding?
At 2 o'clock in the morning, this bomb goes off. Kube's wife somehow survives, but the man himself is killed instantly.
In Minsk, Karl and Nikolai remain unaware of their mission's fulfillment, though news of this shocking assassination will travel quickly.
It's early that morning, a few hours later, that Karl and Nikolai are woken by one of their partisan contacts with blazing red cheeks and looking, full of adrenaline, saying Kube's been killed in his sleep and the SS are hunting all across town for the perpetrators and have blocked off all the exits to the city.
With great haste, Karl and Nikolai jump out of bed, throw on their uniforms for what they hope will be the last time, and plunge into the chaos of this Minsk morning. All around, Nazi officers are raiding buildings in search of the plot's perpetrators. They need to find a way out, fast.
And they flag down the first passing lorry they see, which is full of SS men. And of course, with their uniforms, they're able to hitch a ride.
In the lorry, the SS men bitterly discuss the audacious events of that morning. When they find the scum responsible, there will be hell to pay. That much they can promise.
The lorry goes through the checkpoints, and as soon as it comes to a fork in the road outside the city in the south, they jump off the back into the forest, and after hours of walking through the forest, they come across a search party of partisans who grabs them, takes them back to a base, and there they can kind of finally, somewhat relax, take off their Nazi uniforms and wait for news of when there will be one of these small illicit planes that will be able to fly in at night and take them back across the lines to Moscow.
And so, Nikolai and Karl's mission was finally over. Nikolai's promise to Yelena, that her actions would see her remembered in the history books, turned out to be only partially true. There were a lot of heroics to keep track of during the Nazi occupation.
So one of the top NKVD commanders after the war estimated that the Soviet Union sent 15,000 operatives across the lines during the course of the war. Now, of course, not all of these were these long, intensive preparation missions like Nikolai, but many of them were. There was another operative called Nikolai Kuznetsov who posed as a Nazi, and he killed at least 6 Nazi officials before he was captured and killed. And he would later become one of the really main figures in the pantheon of Soviet war heroes and inspire the kind of next generation of illegals in training as to this is the sort of thing that you can get up to when you can convincingly pose as a foreigner.
But the story of Nikolai the Whistler and those who helped him in the plot to kill Kube would find a different ending.
He actually was repurposed as an assassin after the war, and he was sent in 1954 to carry out the murder of an exiled political dissident figure in Frankfurt. And instead of killing him, he had a crisis of conscience, knocked on his door and said, "I'm been sent from Moscow to kill you and I don't want to do it." He later defected, went to the CIA, moved to the United States, where he lived until 2007. And because of this, his whole story and his role in the assassination of Kube, which was probably the most dramatic and impressive of all of those behind-the-lines hits throughout the war, was slightly written out of the record and isn't part of that Soviet and modern Russian myth-making about the heroics of the illegals.
It was that myth-making that provided the foundation for the next phase of the Soviet illegals program, as the dust of World War II settled and a new, less easily defined conflict began to take shape in its place. And with it, a crop of new recruits ready to leave their mark on history. In the next episode of True Spies, Shaun Walker will introduce you to the very last of the great illegals, a man who stormed Leon Trotsky's villa in Mexico City, survived Stalin's purges, and maneuvered himself into the most privileged corners of the Vatican as the Cold War erupted. Join us as we get to know the ambassador. Disclaimer. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the subject. These stories are told from their perspective, and their authenticity should be assessed on a case-by-case basis. If you're enjoying this podcast, please click now to give it a 5-star rating or leave a review. Ratings and reviews help people discover the podcast and help us bring you more great stories. And if you have some time, why not forward the podcast to a friend?
It's the morning of April the 27th, 1953, and the communist leader of Yugoslavia, Josip Broz Tito, is receiving a diplomat at his White Palace in Belgrade.
Tito is, at this moment, Yugoslavia's president, prime minister, army marshal, and godfather to every 9th child born in the land.
So the man Tito was meeting, his real name wasn't Teodoro Castro. His real name was Josif Grigulevich,
one of the Soviet Union's most accomplished deep cover illegals.
Joseph Stalin had given Grigulevich an important and highly secret mission.
Castro wasn't there to sign an economic deal with Tito. He was there to kill him. True Spies from SPYSCAPE Studios. Search for True Spies wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey folks, get ready for a new season of Blowback coming Monday, September 22nd. This time around, we're covering the Cold War showdown in Africa.
When apartheid South Africa invades the newly independent nation of Angola, revolutionary Cuba sends its own army to defend its African ally, while the United States backs a warlord whose only goal is power.
Subscribe now at blowback.show and get the entire season when it drops, ad-free. Blowback.show.
Life's full of big money decisions. Dividend versus growth stocks, tapping home equity, even navigating tariffs.
And for every smart tip out there, there's another one that sounds smart but isn't.
That's where NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast comes in. I'm Sean Piles, a certified financial planner professional.
And I'm Elizabeth Ayola. On NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast, our finance journalists do the homework so you can make confident wealth-building moves.
Whether you're building your portfolio or protecting it, we've got the facts and a little fun along the way.
Follow NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast on your favorite podcast app.